The NJSpotlight Roundtable series presents The Promise of Offshore Wind. This program was recorded February 17th, 2011, in Trenton, New Jersey. This program is sponsored by Atlantic Wind Connection, Garden State Offshore Energy, and GE Energy. In this episode, members of the panel answer questions posed by Tom Johnson, energy editor of NJSpotlight, and the panel moderator.
I'd like to ask the regulatory folks, they will focus on the net economic benefit in the offshore wind rules. I'm interested in how you're going to arrive at that decision, because you don't seem to have in the draft rules, unless I missed them, any quantitative standards for judging what are the economic benefits, how many jobs would be created, and how that would be weighed against the environmental benefits, reduced air pollution, less greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth.
Correct. Sure, correct. There are not explicit requirements in the regulations as it stands right now, because as everyone at the table has acknowledged, this is new territory. We are looking to have the applicants who come in explain to us what the benefits are. One of the things they're going to need to do is to articulate to us the costs, the benefits, how that is going to be balanced, what a job is worth, how many jobs we're going to see. The board has recommended a number of economic models to be used in the process, but has not mandated it. One of the things the board is looking to do is to make the best decision possible with the best information possible. Today, we're not sure what that information needs to be, but we fully expect the applicants to provide as much information they can, and we're going to do our best with what we can.
Well, Rob, it looks like the ball's in your court. You want to try answering that?
I think the regulations that came out, obviously they're a good start. It'll be interesting to see what the rulemaking process comes out with it ultimately. But the rules are flexible enough where, as Ken said, it gives the developer enough leeway to really propose what they feel are the benefits of their particular project. Certainly, if the board had a common core set of central assumptions, that would be better if, from their perspective, to review applications on a level playing field. But in the absence of those, it is going to be incumbent on all of us developers to propose our projects and as you said, defend them in the process. I suspect that will be a robust process.
Tom, if I could add, I can't speak to the regulations, but I can tell you that the analysis that we've had done by the Brattle Group, which is a well-regarded international consulting firm, is that with the injection of 6,000 megawatts of offshore wind in combination with the backbone system would actually result in $17 billion net present value savings to the ratepayers over the next 20 years. There would be a 16 million ton reduction of CO2. That's the equivalent of taking 3 million cars off the highways. So there are many, many benefits that are going to accrue societally with offshore wind.
And Tom, we developed a net benefits test for when we administer our programs. We look at it basically at a state revenue level, both one-time direct and indirect state revenues, and multiple year direct and indirect revenues. Multiple year direct revenues are things like sales taxes and the purchases of materials, right? An indirect benefit is the when the construction worker goes buys a sandwich at the deli shop down the street. That's an indirect expense. So we quantify that. We actually retained a firm to develop a model for us that we utilize, and we use federally published statistics from that are called they're published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, And they allow us to say, in Essex County, for instance, the multiplier effect for $1 of wages has this kind of ripple effect for state revenues. So we do that, and we look at it on a net present value, and we compare that to the incentives that are passed. So, I mean, this is done fairly standard across the board, and I don't think it's rocket science that we need to recreate the wheel.
Is it possible that a project could be approved? Rob was mentioned scale, and Bob mentioned scale too. Is it possible for a project to be approved by the state or receive the tax credit? Well, no, I guess not the tax credit, without demonstrating huge job growth?
It's possible that if we were to find that the jobs were going to leave the state, and that the adding the new supply chain for selling into the wind market, for instance, retained a line of manufacturers, that's effectively a new job to the state, right? So because they were leaving, now they're not leaving. So that is not necessarily maybe the person. There's not a new person employed, but there certainly is new revenue to the state, revenue that the state wouldn't have received absent the award. So it's possible, but the more likelihood in the case of the Offshore Wind Act. That act particularly requires 300 new jobs to the state. So there would always be new jobs when we have the offshore wind tax credit investment.
What about, you mentioned and others talked about the various components of the offshore wind industry. In the panelist mind, what segment of that has New Jersey the best possibility of attracting jobs? Is it cable? Is it gearboxes? Is it towers, or what?
Yeah, I know we were just recently, my staff, I'm kind of smiling because I'm sure that Jerry's smiling. She was just doing some research, but I think we identified that of all those component parts in New Jersey currently, there's over 400 folks in the supply chain currently doing business. Over 400, about 468 if I recall. And what that could mean for them is a slight tweaking of their current manufacturing facility or how they do their business or their processes. And those are the types of resources that we're looking to put together now to help those businesses to line up for it. That's a little bit of that business registry that I started talking about before. We're trying to inventory currently what we have by way of these infrastructures in the state and how we can then create new opportunities for what has become less of a manufacturing focus for the state of New Jersey.
Those 400, you're talking about 468 different businesses?
Different component parts that we can find that could be supported within the state. So the jobs and the businesses could be multiple of that.
Also, you mentioned in your opening remarks pavilion. There hasn't been a lot of talk about that developer. Could you explain what they're proposing to do?
What I know about the project from what I've read from the releases and understand from the federal government is they put in an unsolicited bid for 1,100 megawatts, proposing alternate technology, which potentially could be a horizontal type of blade. But the key to what they were saying is they would go traditional type of blade, but they were looking to tie into the backbone transmission. So perhaps our friends would know more about that if there's some opportunity there.
Bob?
I don't have anything to add.
No, okay.
Tom, if you don't mind, I could offer something from our perspective. If you think about, the question was, what are the core jobs or the first jobs or the most beneficial jobs? I mean, if you think about it, offshore wind, I think everybody agrees the challenge is cost. So ideally, you've got to get to the point where you hit the optimum point where you add jobs that reduce cost, and if you start adding jobs that increase cost, you have to stop, right? So you can almost imagine a U, if you will. And I think initially, the components that require a high cost to move around, long blades, long heavy towers, big heavy machine head components, those would probably be the ones that would benefit most from being produced locally. And with enough scale, you could probably solve that cost equation for enough components to, you got to amortize the cost of producing them over a certain set of volume. So with enough volume, I think you could solve that equation and shift the low point of the U farther to the right? So it's going to depend on scale. It's going to depend on several things, but I think traditionally you see the high cost of moving components want to be produced locally.
Rich, here in New Jersey, we have 3 or 4 developers vying to build offshore wind farms, and the other states have other developers working. And it sort of seems like there's a competition among the states, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, to lure these jobs and people to their own states. Should there be more collaboration among the states in trying to build this industry?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I mentioned a little bit about this in my introduction. You know, the UK today has the largest installed base. It's over 1 gigawatt, more than 50% of the market. But no turbines have been built in the UK. I think other things are just starting. You know, maybe foundations, which are very large and very hard to move. But today, no turbines have been built there. With the announcement of 32 gigawatts, you know, essentially every manufacturer and their brother has announced plans to move to the UK. So scale is a big piece of this thing. So I think you know, if the UK hadn't announced 32 gigawatts and just kept stringing it out at a project at a time, would there be this mad rush of OEMs to try to get to the UK? I'm not sure. But clearly with it, there is. So the consolidation of enough volume to prove to the industry that there's something sustainable and they can amortize their cost of producing locally over a large enough set of volume, I think it's going to increase the attractiveness.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Tom, and if I could add, you know, when we're thinking about our project, you know, as Rich said, it's really driving cost out of your project. And so, you know, we've all, I think, said the word a zillion times, scale. You know, the scale that we're talking about, and especially with maybe a larger project, it eliminates duplicative overheads on a project basis. It also, as I said before, it leverages purchasing power. And so if you can drive those costs out, you make your project more competitive, and from a manufacturing perspective, it really does, you know, as Rich said, when you give that confidence of several sets of orders, you know, what you don't want is you don't want an industry that has, you know, multiple smaller projects that ramps up in 1 year, maybe over a 3-4 year period, and then all of a sudden just crashes because there's nothing after that. That is not going to bring any manufacturing at all anywhere. So, you know, when we talk about, you know, bringing scale and other things, and, you know, it's really a function of all the states. It's not just New Jersey, but, you know, manufacturers are going to want to see multiple states doing large tranches of offshore wind so that they can, you know, have the confidence to invest, like I said, tens of millions of dollars to bring this industry forward. And it really is you know, and everybody in the industry is working very hard together to try and, you know, create those policies, those momentums to make that happen.
Yet, Tom, forgot. Yet there remains the component of the bill, which is the Offshore Wind and Economic Development Act, and the economic development aspect of that does need to be New Jersey economic development. And so there is a concern about New Jersey ratepayers funding the production of turbines in Maryland. Perhaps, you know, there's always been talk about whether or not that should be a federal process, but so long as it's going to be New Jersey ratepayers paying New Jersey funds, to the extent possible, we would sure like to see New Jersey economic development.
And I just want to add, I mean, we're all talking about economic development, job creation, and all the other things, and it's been mentioned casually. We shouldn't forget about the environmental benefits. I mean, you know, that's one of the things that, when you look at the legislation, it says net economic and environmental benefits. So, you know, clearly, as Ken and Tim have said, the tax credit component of the legislation requires a certain number of jobs, and, you know, that's the correct focus for the tax credits. But really, the legislation doesn't give weight to one or the other in terms of the net economic benefit test. So we really shouldn't forget about the environmental benefits, the reductions in CO, the avoided health care costs. I mean, there's a study out of Massachusetts that says if you take out 2 coal plants or fossil fuel plants out of Massachusetts, you avoid X number of emergency room visits and asthma cases and premature deaths and all the other stuff. I mean, those are legitimate costs. Whether or not they get factored into the ultimate equation is, I think still up to debate. But there's a lot of different factors that really should be considered when you're looking at what the net benefit is. And it just should not simply be economic benefit. Really, What the industry has been trying to do is talk about a long-term investment in the country's future and in the ability of it to generate its own electricity, reduce our dependence on foreign sources of energy, and just move forward.
For the developers, you've all talked about scale, but what are the other challenges, and is there anything else New Jersey should be doing to help make offshore wind a reality?
Well, I will tell you that in the other states that we deal with, which include Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, there are different approaches. Governor O'Malley in Maryland just introduced legislation last week that would require the utilities to purchase 400 to 600 megawatts of offshore wind. And Delaware has been influential already in getting a power purchase agreement signed with Blue Water and Peter Mandelstam. There are what New Jersey is doing, I think, is really terrific. I compliment, not to be buttering up or anything, but I mean, it's really impressive what New Jersey's doing. Ultimately, the states are going to be able to play a role that is absolutely key, and that is we've got to have, the wind developers have got to have a market. And that because at the early stages, the price is a little higher than what is for coal or for gas, but the states are going to have to take the impetus to incentivize or to cause power purchase contracts to be signed so that we can get the scale, not just 1,100 megawatts in New Jersey, but 3,000 megawatts in New Jersey, et cetera. So there's a very important role that the states can play.
Well, the vehicle New Jersey has selected is they're basically going to ask the developers to submit a proposal for offshore renewable energy certificates, similar to what they've done in the solar industry. But today there's a lot of controversy about the solar certificates, and the new Christie administration is considering scaling back its solar program and its energy master plan. What about the process on offshore certificates? Can you, our panelists talk about that and how they see that working out and at what cost to ratepayers?
Well, I guess I'll give that the first shot. Under the legislation, we're expecting submission of OREC proposals. OREC, Offshore Renewable Energy Certificate, represents the environmental attribute of the generation of energy from an offshore windmill. There will be a mandate for the EDCs and for the BGS providers, the electric distribution companies and the energy suppliers to procure a certain amount of energy through offshore wind and to have the associated ORECs to prove that. The failure to purchase enough ORECs will require a OREC alternative compliance payment, which is to ensure that the books stay balanced and there's a continuing flow of funds to the generator, at which point any overcollection that has been collected by the electric companies, for lack of a better term, and moved on to and that does not go to the generators because they have not produced it, will then be returned to the ratepayers. The actual mechanics of that are not included in this round of regulations because we need stakeholder process on that. We have a general concept of how those funds will flow, but the process of bringing the entities who will need to be involved in the banking and mechanics and physical movement of those funds is not something that the board should have mandated without stakeholder process. So right now the vision for distribution and processing of ORECs is something along those lines. The details still need to be worked out. One of the reasons that we have not immediately jumped on this one in the first round of rulemakings is we are not currently expecting the payment of ORECs in the next 18 months. If it turns out that there's an entity that is in the water, constructed, generating energy and earning ORECs, well, we'll move forward and make sure that we have that in place. But right now, the commitment from the board is to make sure that there is an OREC process and that ORECs will be paid based upon generation. The actual tracking in the dollars from point A to point B to point C has not yet been fully developed.
Hey, Tom, if I could go back to your previous question on the challenges or bottlenecks, I forget which one it was. Clearly, scale and all the other things we talked about, but another bottleneck, as we look at studies of Europe, particularly the UK, a clear bottleneck as you go forward and try to grow this very CapEx, high CapEx industry is financing, right? If you look at the beginning of the industry in Europe, it was done by small developers, but quickly shifted over to large utilities that are today funding all or nearly all of these projects on balance sheet. And even these large balance sheet utilities don't have infinite capital on their balance sheet, so they're going to be looking to financing at some point in time. And without a policy that supports a PPA similar to what's in New Jersey today, that's one of the hurdles for financing, but also the ability to control the risks. And one of the risks is potentially lack of one of the infrastructure elements of offshore wind, which is vessels, right? You need vessels to put these things up. And today you have a Jones Act here in the US that requires vessels that go from port to port in the US to be US flagged, US built, et cetera. And there's a lot of discussion on that topic. But even once the turbine is installed, they need to be maintained. And GE, our offshore service strategy is to make turbines that work, so you don't need to mess with them. But there is a thing called Murphy's Law, and it is real. And sometimes you do have to go touch these turbines. And you think about the burden that the developers have to keep these high CapEx projects running. They got to work, right? And you have to have, when the fuel is free, you got to make sure the asset runs. And if you're sitting there needing a vessel, and let's face it, there's very few in the US that can service these offshore wind turbines, and there's very few on the East Coast of the US. And if you get an uptick in the oil industry, there could be none on the East Coast, right? And let's face it, oil is increasing in price every day. So, I mean, one of the significant challenges is financing, and one of the challenges to financing is how do you ensure your risk is low, and one of the challenges to that is vessels. And vessels will be needed regardless if offshore goes in the US, and somebody who solves that problem is going to be sitting there with a pretty decent return on that investment, because whether it's deployed in New Jersey or Massachusetts or somewhere else, those vessels will be needed.
Yeah, I just want to add, because Bob mentioned it earlier, it's a challenge because the lack of a national energy policy really has forced, if you look up and down, the East Coast, the states to take the lead on driving policies and sort of creating the market that really the federal government should have a hand in creating. And so, we at least on behalf of Garden State, and I'm sure the other developers in New Jersey would agree, New Jersey has done a tremendous job in sort of leading, not only with the passage of the Offshore Wind Economic Development Act and the regulations, but just the day-to-day interactions that Michelle and her team and others have had with the federal state task force, with members of what we call BOEMRE, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation and Enforcement, and other agencies. I mean, they've really been working with us to work with the federal government, and I think that's what's really gotten us here. And the continuing challenge is, where the federal government steps up to the plate, and they're starting to a little bit in terms of the Smart from the Start initiative, although there was a little hiccup recently with that. But the states are continuing to do the drive. Maryland with the new announcement of this legislation, Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New York and all the other states. So the challenge is really how to maintain that momentum, because if and Rich said it earlier, I think one of the questions was, how do the states cooperate to maintain what everybody wants to be a very robust, job-intensive industry? And it's really the challenge is to translate the state efforts into a more cohesive, coherent federal initiative where the federal government steps in as a partner with the states and really creates something tremendous.
If I could just add to that in terms of what we're doing with the federal government, New Jersey is also part of the Atlantic Offshore Wind Consortia, which is the Mid-Atlantic states. All the governors signed on to a compact, which brings us together to talk about policy issues, science and technology issues, as well as looking at demo projects and how we can move them forward. So while there absolutely is a race to the water amongst the states, there is dialogue taking place interstate around things we can do to make sure that we're sending, as a nation, the right market signals to the industry.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this program from NJ Spotlight. If you have comments or suggestions, please email them to info@njspotlight.com. NJ Spotlight, where issues matter, on the web at njspotlight.com. For everyone at NJ Spotlight, this is Steve Lubetkin. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you out there on the net. Take good care.